to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. I hope all of you have fully recovered at this point from all of your food comas from both Thanksgiving and all of the Thanksgiving leftovers. And I also hope that you all took advantage and enjoyed what I have dubbed the Grandma's House rule during this holiday season. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Grandma's House rule is, which you probably are because it's literally something I just made up, the idea is, at least for, it's the idea that, when you go to Grandma's house as like a kid, generally speaking, you get spoiled. Now, obviously, this doesn't happen in all cases, but I would say in at least a lot of the cases that I've heard from friends and family members and from, coworkers and stuff with their kids, this seems to be a very common theme that when the grandkids go to Grandma's house, they get spoiled. And generally, something like, their parents say that they can only have, one cookie after dinner, or they can have either ice cream or a cookie, but not both. But then when you go to Grandma's house, it's like, you want ice cream and a cookie? Absolutely, you can have both. Oh, you want an extra scoop of ice cream for your cookie? Sure, go ahead. More the merrier. So hopefully, even if you are following some kind of diet out there, hopefully you still got to indulge and enjoy some of that good food and take a lax on your, lax the restrictions that you normally put on yourself, and just allow yourself to really enjoy the food and have a good time. But with that said, you guys don't come here for the food content. You come here for the various computer science, software development, cybersecurity, and home lab content that we cover on the podcast. So with that said, let's get into this week's trivia question. So this week's trivia question is a rather interesting one because depending on how much you know about technology company history, this one could either be easy or hard depending on how familiar you are. So Apple released their Macintosh 128K with their System 1 software operating system, and Microsoft released their first Windows-based operating system, which was Windows 1.0. But which one of these two came first? So was it Apple's System 1 that shipped with the original 128K Macintosh, or was it Windows 1.0? And bonus points if you can get the year and or the date specifically. So that is your trivia question for the week. So, you guys ever have that feeling of when you know a topic or some kind of subject matter and you hear someone talking about something in your area of expertise and what they're saying is just blatantly wrong and you're just kind of like cringing because you can't stand it? So there was some interesting, I guess, comments on, I think, mostly Facebook, but I also saw this across other news sites as well, claiming to warn users about the quote-unquote dangers of name drop. So if you're not familiar with name drop, we covered in our recap of Apple's WWDC event for 2023. So name drop is basically a feature in iOS 17, and what it allows you to do is it allows you to bring two iPhones together, and then you can basically swap either parts or all of your contact card with the other person. So rather than, the classic, hey, can I get your number real quick? Yeah, and then you have to hand them your phone or let them tell you what their phone number is so you can, type their number in or whatever. So the idea here being you can just bring your two iPhones together. You'll get a thing that'll pop up, asking if you want to, do the whole name drop thing, and then you can accept for how much data you want to give to them, and then you can, swap your information that way. So that was the feature. I thought it would be pretty handy. Personally, I've never used it. I haven't used it yet. But apparently people were trying to warn of the dangers and how this was some privacy nightmare or something. So here is one of the quotes from one of the posts. I believe this is from a local police department or something. So it says, "Attention residents. The sheriff's office has become aware of a new feature in the latest iOS update called Name Drop. This feature is enabled by default and allows individuals with this feature to place their phone next to your iPhone or your child's iPhone and automatically receive their contact information." So, yeah, that's at best a very, very, very simplified explanation, and at worst just completely wrong, because there is no way that someone could just bring their iPhone next to yours and get your information. That's not how the name drop feature works. In order for the name drop feature to work, you actually have to first you have to have your phone unlocked with either Face ID, Touch ID, or your passcode in order to use Name Drop. So it's not like, you'll be walking down the street and then some stranger will bring an iPhone close to yours in your pocket and get your information. That's not how this works. So so you have to have the phone unlocked, number one. And then number two, you can choose how much of your information you want to share. And you also have to confirm that you want to actually do the share. So it's not just this, someone walks past you type of a deal. You actually have to put the, thought into accepting that you want to do the transfer. So I don't know how people got so messed up with this. I don't know if this was, like I said, I don't know if this was just a super oversimplification and people just kind of ran with it. But it's been kind of making the rounds this week, and it's been kind of annoying me because it's just not accurate. But anyway, yeah, so if you were concerned about Name Drop, don't be, because the only way that someone's going to, I guess, quote unquote, steal your information from you via Name Drop is if you are an active participant in unlocking your phone and confirming, to give them your information, which at that point, I don't know if I would necessarily consider that them stealing your information. I guess, of course, unless you have a gun to your head or something, or you're being threatened or something against your will. In that case, sure, you kind of got your information stolen. But I would say in 99% of the use cases, that's not going to happen. So you would have to be a willing participant. So I say it's probably nothing to worry about. So yeah, any, I guess, news organization that is listening to this, which is probably none, but on the off chance, maybe try to do a little more due diligence before you take a story like this and run with it. So I'll have a link down in the show notes for some more information on this topic as well. So around this point in the episode, we would get into this week's cybersecurity tip. But seeing as what the title of this episode is, I think we will kind of skip that, because the article that we're going to cover as kind of the main, I guess, turkey and gravy and mashed potatoes, trying to keep with the Thanksgiving theme, I guess, a little bit, or meat and potatoes, whatever you want to call it. The main story that I want to talk about in an article basically covers a lot of cybersecurity stuff, so I was just going to kind of leave it to that. But going back to Apple real quick, they did have a couple more zero-day vulnerabilities that they patched, so I believe this now gets them up to 20 0 days patched since the start of the year. So according to Apple, Apple's aware of a report that there was an issue against versions of iOS, specifically 16.7.1, and I believe this was also in macOS and iPadOS as well. So basically what it was there were two bugs found in the WebKit browser engine. And what this would allow attackers to do is gain access to sensitive information via an outbound read weakness to gain arbitrary code execution via a memory corruption bug on vulnerable devices, and basically craft malicious web pages to exploit this bug in WebKit. And as you'll recall from previous things we've talked about on the podcast, arbitrary code execution is pretty bad when it comes to exploits, because basically it allows an attacker to write code to do whatever they want and have your system execute it. So in essence, the sky's kind of the limit as far as what they can do. Of course, they have to be within the architecture of the system. So if they're trying to exploit ARM assembly code on an x86 architecture machine, it's not going to work. But if they're doing some other kind of execution, then yeah, you could be in for a pretty bad day. So the Apple says that it addressed these security flaws for devices running iOS 17.1.2, iPadOS 17.1.2, macOS Sonoma 14.1.2, and Safari 17.1.2. So definitely make sure that you are updating your systems and your Safari versions to make sure that you are up to date and not vulnerable to these zero-day exploits. And with that, I think we can move into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. Now, for this week, it was an interesting one, since I brought my home lab on the go. And you're probably thinking that's not very impressive because you've talked about your VPN many times, and that's pretty boring. Which, yes, I agree, but this is a little bit of a twist. So I was pretty much stuck in a hotel room for the vast majority of this past week, which, by the way, hotels, can you please do something about your Wi-Fi? Because it is absolutely horrendous. It's kind of sad when your cellular data makes your hotel Wi-Fi. I mean, it basically, what it came down to was it seemed like my cellular data was like gigabit speeds, and my hotel, compared to the hotel Wi-Fi, which obviously I was not getting anywhere close to gigabit speeds on cellular, but I digress. I believe I was getting around like 2 megabits per second up and down on the one test that was actually even able to run. A lot of them just kind of failed when I tried to run them. But the one that actually did succeed, it was like 2 megabits per second. So if you guys could do something about your atrocious internet speeds, that would be great. Another thing that would be pretty cool too is if you could actually provide like an Ethernet jack inside the hotel room. That would be pretty cool too. Maybe I didn't get a expensive enough room to get that option, but my room did not have it. It'd be cool if it did, but it didn't. But either way, they'd probably still throttle it to and make it terrible anyway. But I guess a man can dream, because there ain't no way I'm spending, money on that upgrade because, yeah, I might get faster speed, but it's still probably going to be pretty abysmal. But anyway, getting back on track a little bit here. So if you've ever used hotel Wi-Fi, generally speaking, at least in my experience, it's free to everyone and you don't need a password. And the way they authenticate you is by sending you to like some kind of web portal, and then you have to like quote unquote authenticate yourself with like your last name and room number, for example, and that's how they authenticate you. So a little tedious. Again, you could argue the security's probably not that good, which, for the record, in case anyone was wondering, yes, my phone and laptops were connected to my VPN back to my house the entire time, so none of my actual internet traffic, which granted really wasn't that much, was going all over an encrypted tunnel back to my house. So even if the hotel wanted to see what I was doing, they wouldn't be able to. But again, trying to get back on track since we keep going on these tangents. What I mean by I made a mini home lab on the go is what I did was I took one of my laptops that I had and I connected it to the hotel Wi-Fi. And then I plugged in, I don't have an Ethernet jack on the laptop, so I plugged in an adapter for an Ethernet jack, which I then connected into a router that I brought from my house and used the router as my own Wi-Fi hotspot, essentially. So then I could connect my other devices, like my other laptop and my phone, to my router that way, so I wouldn't have to go through the whole process of connecting to the hotel Wi-Fi with them. So this isn't the first time I've done something like this. In college, I did a very similar thing, except I actually had an Ethernet jack in my room, so I could just plug my router directly into the Ethernet jack, which, by the way, it might be the same thing for the hotel too. I'm not sure, but I definitely know in my college dorm room that was definitely something I wasn't allowed to do because you were only, I think, technically allowed to have, 5 devices connected to at least the Wi-Fi. I don't remember if you were limited to Ethernet or not, but I know Wi-Fi you were at least limited. You were definitely limited to 5 devices. And you guys know me well enough, I think, at this point to know that I had more than 5 devices connected to the Wi-Fi, but I didn't have to worry about doing any kind of upcharge and actually paying for the internet at school because I had my router solution, which I think, which technically, like I said, I wasn't allowed to have, but I'll just state for the record that I wasn't the only person that was doing this because I know some of my other friends that did the same thing. But anyway, I'm assuming the hotel would probably have a similar restriction, but I can't say for sure. I mean, there's probably something in that, terms of service that everyone just agrees to without reading. But I'm assuming I probably wasn't necessarily allowed to do it, but I did it anyway. But it was nicer in the sense that I didn't have to worry about connecting other devices to the hotel Wi-Fi. But I also did a similar thing few years ago when I was doing an internship, and I was basically staying in it wasn't a hotel, but it wasn't an apartment. It was kind of like I think it was technically called like an extended stay hotel or something like that. But essentially I did the exact same thing. Except this time I took my Mac Mini with me and I hooked it up to the TV that was in the room. And then I used the Ethernet jack to hook up to my router and then just connected all my other devices to the router rather than having to connect to the TV. And again, that internet was painfully slow as well. But yeah, so that was essentially my mini home lab on the go, doing some mini networking, I guess you could say. So that was, I guess, I mean, I had to entertain myself somehow when I was, in a hotel room for basically a week. But also the other thing I did was I did a tiny bit of game programming, really not much because I was kind of busy with other things. But I did get a little more game programming, continued to add a few more state machines. But again, not a whole lot. And I think that was basically it. So now I think we should get into the fun stuff, which is this article that I wanted to cover, which is an article from Bleeping Computer, and it's the NSA and CISA revealing their top 10 cybersecurity misconfigurations. So this one ought to be pretty good. So, of course, NSA being everyone's three-letter agency, the National Security Agency, and CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Everyone loves the alphabet boys, but they did put together a pretty interesting list here. Which the way they came up with this list was they discovered during their red and blue team assessments. And mind you, when we're talking about like red and blue team assessments and security audits of companies to find this data in order to figure out what the biggest misconfigurations are, we're not talking about like the small mom and pop shops that might not have like the best cybersecurity hygiene. We're talking about the big companies that have the money and the resources to pay a third-party agency or the government or even the government itself to do an audit on themselves to figure out where they're lacking as far as their cybersecurity is concerned. So these are like, the big dogs that really should have their stuff together. But as we'll see as we go through this list, you could make the argument that they might not. So the first one on this list is default configurations of software and applications. So I think most of us, when you first are trying out either an operating system for the first time, a service for the first time, a piece of software for the first time, you're probably not really getting into the weeds and going into the configuration files and modifying configs, which for some applications you honestly kind of don't need to. For instance, I've heard pfSense, for example, is a pretty good one. Since I've heard stories of people asking, what are good default settings to change in pfSense, and I've heard the response being, if there were changes that should be made to the default settings, we would make them the default settings. But obviously pfSense is a little more security focused when it comes to like applications and things like that, compared to just your generic run-of-the-mill piece of software. So there is a little bit of a different mindset there, but for things like your operating system, for example, there's a chance that, especially on like Linux distributions, some things will just kind of be open and running by default, which you may or may not know. One that's fairly common is SSH, which generally speaking, if you're going to be doing any kind of remote management of the system, you'll probably want that enabled anyway, but I mean, there's other things that might be in there. Other things are like web servers, for example. They generally have pretty in-depth config files, similar to SSH. I mean, SSH by default will allow passwords, and sometimes even allow root accounts. I think it kind of depends on the distro if it'll allow a root account or not. But that's definitely something which we've talked about on the podcast that you would want to change from the default configuration to essentially harden your SSH connections to make it harder for an attacker to randomly guess a username and password. And, if you have root available to log in as root, trying to log in as root and randomly guess the password, that's obviously something you don't want. So changing the default configuration sometimes can be very beneficial, especially depending on what the software is. So that is something that I would probably recommend, even if you don't necessarily want to change any of the configuration for, the software, the application, or the service, or whatever it is. It's definitely still a good idea to at least look at some of those configs to kind of see what options are in there. And generally speaking, the config files are usually pretty well documented. They'll have kind of like an overview of, what the section or the different types of configuration options are and what they do and what they mean. Of course, you can also just read the documentation as well. But this would, kind of help you better understand what your software is doing rather than just, software go burr and it just does what it does. So trying to, get that deeper understanding of what's going on under the hood can definitely be beneficial, both from an education aspect and also from a security aspect as well. And number 2, this one is a doozy. So number 2 is improper separation of user and administrative privilege. How many times have we talked on the podcast about the principle of least privilege? And as a quick recap, if you're unfamiliar or if you forgot, the principle of least privilege, in essence, is you only have access to the things you absolutely need access to, and you don't have the ability to do anything else. So the basic, easy example is, say, you're on a Windows system and you have your standard user account and you have your administrator account. So the administrator account can obviously do things like update the system registry, install software, uninstall software, change group policy settings, all that good stuff, while the regular standard user can't do any of that. And I think it's pretty safe to say that it's kind of obvious why you would want that, because you don't want some random Joe Schmo mucking up something that they shouldn't be getting into or installing something that they shouldn't and potentially compromising their system or potentially the corporate network. So, but it goes beyond like just Windows too, right? Like if you're trying to, give users access to, say, a remote server. So say you have a environment and you have, say, a development server that, developers can test their code on, right? If they're just like pushing their code to run and test, they don't necessarily need to be able to install software. Now, the developer is going to push back and say, well, I'm the developer and I should be able to install whatever software I need because it makes my life a lot easier. And again, that kind of goes back to the convenience for security argument, which is we've talked about plenty of times, which is the idea that the more convenient something is, the less secure it is, and the more secure something is, the less convenient it is. And for the record, being that I am a developer, I am definitely of the mindset that I want the administrator account because it just makes my life so much easier. Because if I'm trying to run a piece of software or do some kind of development and I need to download another package or I need another piece of software to, test against or run against or whatever the case may be, if I don't have the ability to download and install that myself, it just slows down my workflow and makes me less productive. So there is the argument to be made, but again, if you're not actually a network or a system administrator, you shouldn't have the administrator privileges just from a pure cybersecurity standpoint. So apparently people are getting administrator privileges that shouldn't have administrator privileges. And another one that I've also heard for this is like when if you hire some third party or some contractor or something to do some installation on a system or whatever, and you give them a temporary account, giving them more privilege than they actually need to do whatever they need to do. That's kind of another instance. But again, remember, principle of least privilege. So if you don't need the ability to do something, your account shouldn't have the ability to do that thing. So like the basic easy example, if you don't ever need to install software because you just use the computer and, write Word documents and PowerPoints and Excel spreadsheets and that kind of a thing, you shouldn't have the ability to install software. Plain and simple. Number 3 is insufficient internal network monitoring. So this one is I would say it's not, I guess, as much of a home lab related as it is to like a corporate environment type thing. So, because generally in a home lab situation, obviously you're doing it for learning purposes. So, I mean, there are definitely plenty of people in home labs that do have like internal monitoring for all their networks. But the core here is kind of the idea that generally when you're thinking about like network security, the focus is on the firewall, like the external firewall and the intrusion detection and intrusion prevention system that is basically your gateway to protect you from the bad internet and all the bad things that are trying to come in and attack you, right? So you have tons of monitoring on that aspect, but you kind of lack internally. And the reason why this could become an issue is if you don't have good internal monitoring on your network, if someone does get in, they can basically do whatever lateral movement they want, and you could be none the wiser if you don't have good internal monitoring. So it is something good to have, whether it's something like an Uptime Kuma or something that can check like system health, or you have some other kind of logging monitor solution that'll log different types of activity on the internal network. Some kind of monitoring solution to help you detect if someone is inside your network and potentially doing something that they shouldn't be. Because like I said, it's definitely important to have that focus on the external, traffic coming in, but you also have to be mindful of the traffic inside in case, someone downloads a piece of ransomware or something that somehow bypassed the firewall detection, and they run that, and it starts encrypting everything on your network. If you don't have good internal monitoring, that could get out of hand pretty quickly. And that kind of leads into the fourth item on this list, which is lack of network segmentation. Now, I have to admit, I probably fall into this category of lack of network segmentation. And for the record, I guess me trying to cope and, excuse my actions here, I do have some network segmentation, but it's definitely not, great. You could argue it's not great. Now, you could make the argument in a home lab scenario this might not necessarily be as critical, but at the same time, you could make the argument that you should be doing it anyway because, the purpose of the home lab is to, learn things, and this would be a good learning experience. So if we take this back to my network, for example, I do have basic network segmentation in the sense that, I have my standard, I guess, client, you could say, devices. So like things I'll connect to Wi-Fi, like my phone, like my smart TV, some laptops, that kind of a thing. That stuff's on its own network, and then my server home lab network is also on its own separate network. And while that's good as far as network segmentation goes, it's also not good because if, say, a threat actor managed to get in to my server network, they basically have free reign to access anything they want within that server, in my server network. So obviously not ideal. So that's why, network segmentation is key, but it's even more key in like the enterprise and the corporate realm, because this, you kind of, again, have to look at it at the principle of least privilege, in the sense that if I have, say, a database server, like, it doesn't need, like, your other applications on the network don't necessarily need to access that. So you really have to figure out, okay, what applications and services need to access one another, and then you lump those together and put them in, say, their own VLAN, for example, and segment them off from the rest of the network. And the reason why you really want to do this is going back to that lateral movement aspect, because if you can prevent how much an attacker can move if they gain access to a system, it greatly reduces the damage they will do to your network and your infrastructure. Because if they, say, get on to remotely do some exploit and gain access to one of your servers, if they can only then reach one additional server, or they can't reach any additional servers at all, the impact is going to be greatly reduced, seeing that they could only take out one or two servers, compared to every single server on your network being accessible to them, and they could take out everything potentially. So the key for the main reason you want to have, you could say lots, but I guess the better term would be deliberate network segmentation, would be to reduce the attack surface. If an attacker does gain access, it restricts the amount of lateral movement that they can do. And moving on to number 5 is poor patch management. So I think we've all heard the stories of the systems that go unpatched for various reasons. And as we saw earlier in this episode, actually, talking about the vulnerabilities with Apple and those 2 0 days, if you leave those unpatched, you're basically just giving attackers free reign to attack you. So you always want to make sure that you're up on your security patches, and there's a couple different ways you can do this. On certain Linux distros, you can enable like live patching, which will basically auto, update security updates for you. You could run like a cron job or something to update your servers for you. You could have an Ansible playbook that runs on a recurring schedule to constantly check and do updates for your servers. I mean, it's so easy to ensure that your servers are up to date. There's really no excuse to not keep your servers patched for security reasons. Now, some will try to make the argument that, if I try to patch the system, that could potentially cause issues to some software that I'm running, and that could, break something. And while you might be correct on that, you also have to wager that with, okay, so do I want to potentially have to make some updates to the software I'm running to work with these new patches, or do I want my entire system to be potentially vulnerable to an exploit? I mean, I'll leave that up to you. But personally, I would rather have my system not be able to be easily exploited through some kind of known vulnerability that there's a patch for, rather than potentially risking my service going down for a little bit while I, patch a bug or something that was in an update, for example. And also, it should be noted that if you're keeping up with your updates on a regular basis, generally speaking, the delta between those updates is going to be very minimal, which greatly reduces the risk of a update or a patch potentially bricking some kind of service or application that you're running on your system. Since generally the ways that you'll run into these issues where your system or an application you're running will run into an issue is when you try to do a big OS upgrade. So, for example, some of the services that I'm currently running in my home lab, when I do just your standard updates, your apt update or your pacman-syu or your DNF update or, whatever distro you're running. When you do your updates, those don't break anything. Everything runs fine. But for example, some of the systems I'm running, running them on Ubuntu, and when I would try to upgrade the release version from, say, 20.04 to 22.04, that would cause things to break. So when you're doing big OS upgrades like that, you could potentially see some breakage. But generally speaking, if you're just doing the incremental updates within the OS release cycle, like security patches and that kind of a thing, generally not going to be an issue, assuming you're keeping up with them on a fairly regular basis, which you should be doing. So yeah, make sure you keep your systems up to date. A lot of this kind of sounds like it should go without saying, but apparently it needs to be said. So that's why we're here today. So number 6 is bypass of system access controls. Oh boy. I have definitely been a bypasser of system access controls for sure. You guys know I've told a couple of stories on the podcast of how I've bypassed various types of access controls. One of them being that command prompt bypass that allows you to access the command prompt even if it's disabled by your administrator. And then there was another example I gave where a laptop that I had for a company that I was interning for didn't allow me to write any data to any kind of USB devices, but if I spun up a virtual machine and passed the USB device through to the virtual machine, I could write to it all day long. And the cool thing about that is you can pass shared folders into the virtual machine, basically giving you access to write stuff from your actual laptop or desktop or whatever to the flash drive, bypassing the system access controls. Now, some of these are kind of harder to stop than others, but again, it comes down to the kind of the idea of convenience for security, because I would wager that your average Joe that isn't super tech savvy, for example, is probably not going to think of, hey, let me try to spin up a virtual machine to then pass a shared folder into it and pass a USB device into it so I can then write to the USB device. I don't think that's going to be going through most people's heads, and to be honest, the only reason that I even thought about or tried to do it was just for the sake of, can I do this, rather than I need to get something off this computer. It was mainly just, to see if I could do it, rather than, I'm gonna, which I guess that's kind of the, the blue team versus red team aspect, or the white hat versus the black hat aspect when it comes to hackers, because when you're talking about The red teaming, like red teaming, you're trying to find ways to exploit. Blue teaming, you're trying to find ways to defend. So but obviously both of you are good guys in this case if you're doing like a red team, blue team, type of assessment. But then, of course, you have your white hat and your black hat hackers. The black hat's obviously trying to be nefarious and whatnot, and the white hat's just trying to defend against the black hats by doing the exploits to then educate whoever. Think of this as like kind of like your pen testers. So I was essentially just trying to, white hat my way through, seeing if I could do something just to see if it was possible, but not actually do it for any kind of nefarious reason. But nonetheless, that was a bypass of access control for sure. And number 7 is weak or misconfigured multi-factor authentication methods. So you guys have heard about 2FA through SMS, right? I'm sure you have, because that is, we've talked about it before. It's better than nothing as far as two-factor, but it's also not great because, first off, it sends the authentication code to you through SMS, which, first off, isn't encrypted at all. So if you have a man-in-the-middle attack or someone's, spoofing your phone number, they can get access to that code, no problem, and access your account that way. So that would be an instance of a weak multi-factor authentication method. Another one would be if you, some sites, if you forget your, if you don't have the ability to do your two-factor, you can say, like, I don't have access to it right now or something, and you can essentially bypass the two-factor without even using it. That would be another instance. Another one would be if the device that you're logging into and the device that you have your two-factor on are the same device, because kind of the point of the two-factor or the multi-factor, however you want to put it, is they're separate things, right? It's like something something you have, and something you are. So if it's a something you know and something you have, and the something you know is your password, and the something you have is your, say, your authenticator app on your phone. If you have your phone with you and you're trying to log into an account from your phone, you could make the argument that that would be a weak or misconfigured multi-factor authentication method because it's right there on your phone. And this is compounded by the fact if you have a password manager and you have your password manager on your phone, like as an app or something, that can autofill your passwords for you, because then in a hypothetical situation, if an attacker would get access to your phone, and assuming it was unlocked, of course, they could essentially get free reign to access whatever accounts you have in your password manager and your multi-factor authentication app, because they could just go to whatever app or website, log in through your password manager, and then use your two-factor app to authenticate, and boom, they get free reign. Now, there's obviously ways to mitigate this depending on the password manager you use. Like, for example, I use Bitwarden. And for that, if I don't, like, I forget what the timeout is, but you can set a timeout where if you don't access it within a given amount of time, you either have to re-authenticate with your master password, or you have to, like, do a biometrics update authentication. So that would be kind of a way to prevent, assuming an attacker would somehow get access to your device, and you do have that timeout feature. If you weren't already authenticated through that, they would potentially have to break that as well. So just kind of going back to the additional layers of security, the onion, if you want to call it, or the Swiss cheese method, or however you want to say it, the less convenient it might be having to re-authenticate yourself with, biometrics, which honestly isn't much of an inconvenience at all, in my opinion, or a master password in order to get access to that. So that's another one. Number 8, insufficient access control list, or ACLs, on network shares and services. So this is kind of going back to the principle of least privilege, in a sense, of, people having access to either folders on a shared drive or files on a shared drive that they shouldn't have access to. Potentially being able to execute things on a shared drive that may or may not be something you want. I guess you'd have to ask yourself, why would someone need to execute something that's on a shared drive? And if that answer is they shouldn't, then you shouldn't allow files to be executed on a shared drive. There's ways that you can, when you mount shares, that you can restrict that. And this also kind of goes back to the network segmentation in a little bit too, since when you're segmenting your network in general, you can set access control lists as far as like what VLANs can do, as far as can this VLAN talk to that VLAN, that kind of a thing. So access control lists are definitely something that you should be implementing, because that can even further help secure and lock down systems to prevent bad things from happening. Here's another one. Number 9, poor credential hygiene. Yeah. So you know the guy that has his password as password, or the person that has their password written on a sticky note taped stuck to their monitor or under their keyboard. Yeah, there's some bad password hygiene out there. I guess, the common ones being the weak passwords, and, passwords like written down on pieces of paper that aren't secured. Because it's one thing to write down your password, because, essentially you're doing the same thing with the password manager, right? You're writing down your password, which people, would argue you should never write down your passwords, which if you're using a password manager, which basically everyone recommends, because, how can you remember all these complex passwords? You're essentially writing down the password. But the difference is the password manager is encrypted and locked behind hopefully a very secure password that and so in this way, even if someone did get access to like your password vault, unless they had your master password, they wouldn't be able to get anything out of that, right? So if you were writing down all your passwords on a piece of paper, hopefully you wouldn't be, putting them on sticky notes and sticking them to your monitor, or having them in some place that anyone could access. So if you are writing down your passwords on pieces of paper, hopefully you are taking the proper precautions to secure said passwords, so not anyone can just, get access to them. Number 10, and the last one, is unrestricted code execution. So this one is, I guess, a little more niche. Like, this one isn't, it's not like, poor credential hygiene, or, not monitoring your network or segmenting your network, or improper, user admin privilege type of a thing. But this one, you could potentially make the argument that there is a kind of a trade-off of you either do this one or you do the other ones. But I think, just in general, it's, to me as a whole, it is kind of, I guess, shocking to see that these are like the top 10 things, because the majority of these are, at least in my view, kind of, common sense. But then again, I kind of come from a little bit of a cybersecurity type background. And I'm sure most of you that have listened to this podcast and if you don't have a cybersecurity background, or maybe starting to get a little bit of one as you listen to the podcast and we talk about, various cybersecurity topics, hopefully this would kind of see like, yeah, no duh, like, I mean, you should be doing that, or you shouldn't be doing that, depending on the topic here. But one thing that I heard that was actually really interesting about this, at least in the same vein when it comes to like security, is if you're doing a really good job at security, it looks like you're doing absolutely nothing. Which, on the one hand, makes kind of no sense, but at the same time makes complete sense. Because on the one hand, like, obviously, if you're, making sure your systems are secure and your network secure and you have internal monitoring and you're keeping up with your patches and, you ensure that your user and admin privileges are properly separated and all this stuff, on the surface, you're doing a lot to make sure that, all these things are in place. But on the other hand, it looks like you're doing absolutely nothing because there's no ransomware, there's no cyber attack, no DDoS attack, none of this stuff, because you did such a good job, implementing all these cybersecurity principles. Now, I guess it also has to go without saying that nothing's perfect. There is no silver bullet, because if there was, everyone would be using it. But, it's kind of interesting when you think about the fact that if you're a cyber security person and that's your job, to ensure that systems are properly secure and updated and the network secure and, proper privileges are in place and all that kind of thing, the way that you can kind of see that you're doing good at your job is nothing happens. But at the same time, if nothing happens, that also doesn't validate that you're doing a good job either. Because it could just be that no one's tried to attack you. Or, people have tried to attack you and your defenses have, held up and whatnot. But depending on the type of attack vector that they could potentially be going for, you may or may not know that you're, being attacked. Now, I guess depending on, what kind of monitoring, you had set up, you might be able to catch that if people are trying to attack you. But from the higher ups perspective, they're kind of oblivious. They see that, nothing happened and they're like, what's this cybersecurity guy doing? He's just, sitting over there in his office and we're not recovering from any kind of cyber attacks and, there's no kind of cyber incidents. So like, what's he doing? Is he even doing his job? But no, he's actually doing a pretty good job because he's keeping you safe. But again, like I said, maybe nothing's happening. Which I guess that kind of goes back to another thing I talked about before, which is that you should, try to audit your network and try to pen test yourself. And this is, the purpose of, hiring pen testers to actually try to break into your systems and hack your network and gain unauthorized privilege and all this stuff, is to test to see if your, cybersecurity principles that you've implemented are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. Because, like I said, if nothing happens or nothing ever happens, that either means you're doing a really good job or no one's actually tried to attack you and you potentially don't know which one it is. So that's where, you'd hire some kind of pen tester, or you have, some red team, blue team type thing going on within your company, or you do it yourself in your home lab, to kind of play out these scenarios of someone trying to, perform a cyber attack on you. And you can actually see how your principles that you've implemented actually work, in a real world scenario. So that was, I guess, your cybersecurity wake-up call. Hopefully, those 10 things that we listed here, hopefully those were kind of, to you, were like, yeah, no duh, and you didn't fall into any of those categories. Unfortunately, I kind of did fall into one of those categories, specifically that lack of network segmentation thing in my home lab I mentioned. Yeah, so I mean, I guess it happens to everyone, but the idea here is to raise that awareness and keep adding those layers of Swiss cheese, keep adding different layers of security, because again, it comes down to that age-old saying, right? The more convenient something is, the less secure it is, and the more secure something is, the less convenient it is. So for you basically have to find, there's really, because everyone's environment is different, right? My home lab environment is different from your home lab environment. It's different from Joe, from Seattle's home lab environment. It's different from Anne's home lab environment in Maine. Everyone's home lab's different. Every corporate infrastructure is different. So there's really no one-size-fits-all solution. But again, it kind of has to come back down to how convenient do you want it to be? How secure do you want it to be? And what is your risk tolerance? So if you have a really high risk tolerance and you're really willing to bet the farm on maximum convenience, you do you. If you want to have the most locked down and secure system ever because your risk tolerance is super, super low, and you're going to have to take like 20 minutes to log into your account because of all the various multi-step factor authentications that you have to go through to verify that it's actually you, by all means, go ahead and do that. So hopefully, kind of going over this list here can, help you think about your home lab or your corporate environment that you're part of, and just kind of do an analyzing of where you fall in this, and kind of do an assessment of what your risk tolerance is, how convenient do you want things to be, and how secure you want things to be. So that was kind of the kind of cybersecurity, I don't know if I'd say deep dive, but kind of overview that I wanted to go through with that article. And with that, I think we should get back to our trivia question for the week. So if you'll recall, the trivia question for this week is in regards to operating systems, specifically the first ones released by both Apple and Microsoft. So Apple released their Macintosh 128K with their System 1 software operating system, and Microsoft released their first window-based operating system, which was Windows 1.0. But which one came first? Was it System 1 or was it Windows 1.0? And again, there's bonus points if you can get either the years or the actual dates. So if you said System 1, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. Now, they're actually fairly close together, so it would, I guess, be a little bit of a... So this is why I said depending on how much your technology company history, because, I mentioned the System 1, released with the Macintosh 128K. So if you remember, the original Macintosh released in 1984. So if you knew when that came out, then it was just kind of a guessing game of, okay, did Windows come out before 1984 or after 1984? And it turns out that Windows 1.0 came out after 1984 in 1985, and you potentially could have known that because Steve Jobs and Bill Gates kind of got a little heated, back in the day, because Steve Jobs was claiming that, I forget exactly what, I don't remember if it was, I'm pretty sure it was Steve Jobs claimed that, Bill Gates and Microsoft essentially copied, Mac OS's Windows design or something and kind of made their own thing. But I mean, if you go back to like Android and iOS or any kind of software that competes with some other kind of software, they're always stealing ideas from each other. I mean, it goes back to, the 80s and potentially even before that. So it's not necessarily a new concept, but if you did know kind of your tech history, this one might have been pretty easy for you. But otherwise, it might have been a little bit harder for you. But regardless, even if you had absolutely no idea, at least you still had a 50-50 chance of getting this one right this week. So hopefully you got it. And if you did, hope you also enjoyed the episode. And if you did, leave a rating and review and subscribe and all that good stuff. And if you have any questions or comments for future episodes, you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. There's a link for that down in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.